I never thought something like this could happen to me. I was just an ordinary woman with an ordinary routine, and until that night, my life was far from a horror movie. But everything changed that night. After months of not going out much, I decided to give Tinder a try. After all, what could go wrong? That's how I met Mark, a guy who seemed to be exactly what I was looking for. He had an easy smile, was great at conversation, and we shared similar interests. I didn't see any reason to turn down his invitation for a date. We met at a cozy bar in the center of a small town in rural Ohio, where we both lived. It was a discreet place with rustic decor, making the atmosphere warm and welcoming. Within the first hour, Mark had already won me over. He seemed to know exactly what to say to make me laugh, and I felt relaxed, comfortable around him. The conversation flowed naturally, and I began to think that maybe I had finally found someone interesting. After a few hours, Mark suggested we go for a drive. He said he knew a lookout point in the nearby hills where the view of the city lights was spectacular. I hesitated for a moment. After all, I barely knew him, but he was so convincing that I ended up agreeing. We got into his car, a sleek black sedan that matched his sophisticated appearance. At that moment, I didn't suspect a thing. As we drove away from the city center, I noticed that Mark seemed a bit nervous, but I chalked it up to first date jitters. He kept the conversation going, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, like he was worried about something. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He smiled, but it was a tense smile. "Yeah, just a bit distracted," he replied. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back now, I realize it should have been a red flag. When we reached a deserted road, with nothing but sparse trees around, Mark sped up the car. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no lights in sight. I started to feel uncomfortable, and the atmosphere that had been calm now felt tense and heavy. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then, out of nowhere, I saw the blue and red lights of a police car in the rearview mirror. My heart began to race. "Mark, why is the police following us?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He didn't answer right away, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Without a word, he sped up even more, the car's engine roaring as the police lights drew closer. That's when I realized something was very wrong. "Mark, what's going on?" I insisted, now clearly panicking. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. Before I could react, he made a sharp turn, leaving the main road and heading down a dirt path I hadn't even noticed before. The chase was officially on, and I was trapped in the middle of something that felt straight out of a nightmare. The dirt road was rough, and the car jolted violently as Mark tried to distance us from the police. I clung to the seat, panic taking over me. "You stole this car, didn't you?" I yelled, finally grasping the gravity of the situation. He just nodded, the look on his face dark and almost apathetic. I was in shock, unable to process how the night had taken such a terrifying turn. The sound of sirens grew louder, and the blue and red lights reflected through the windows. I knew we were cornered. Mark made one last desperate maneuver, turning the car onto an even narrower road, surrounded by tall, dense trees. But it was no use. The car skidded in the mud, the tires spinning helplessly as the vehicle came to a complete stop. We were trapped. Before I could say anything, Mark jumped out of the car and started running, leaving me alone in the vehicle. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. Within seconds, the police arrived and surrounded me. They pulled me out of the car, pointing guns and shouting orders. I could barely breathe, terror consuming me entirely. It wasn't until they had me handcuffed in the back of the police car that I started to cry, the weight of everything that had happened finally hitting me. Mark was captured shortly after, not far from where we had stopped. I found out that he was a wanted criminal for a series of car thefts and frauds, and that he had used Tinder as a way to escape, trying to keep up a facade of normalcy. As I sat in the police station, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, I felt a mix of relief and horror. Relief that I was alive and hadn't become another one of Mark's victims. Horror because, for a moment, I thought I was meeting someone special, only to discover he was a monster disguised as an ordinary person. That night, I learned the hard way that sometimes the real terror doesn't come from the supernatural, but from the people around us. I've never been the type to get easily intimidated. As a young professional living in Los Angeles, I always thought I was pretty good at reading people. But sometimes, life throws things at you that you're just not prepared for. It all started so harmlessly, so normally. I was on Tinder, an app I'd used a bunch of times to meet new people. That's where I met David, a guy who seemed interesting and totally normal. He had a friendly smile, and our conversations flowed naturally. After a few days of chatting, we decided to meet up for dinner. We picked a nice restaurant in Santa Monica, with a beautiful view of the ocean. The night was perfect, and I felt comfortable around David. He was charming, asked questions about my life, and seemed genuinely interested. But as the evening went on, something shifted. His posture became tense, and he started asking more specific questions about where I lived, who I lived with, and what my daily routines were. These questions made me uneasy, but I brushed them off, thinking he was just curious. After dinner, David suggested we go somewhere quieter, maybe take a walk in a more secluded area, away from the crowds. The idea of leaving the safety of the restaurant to go somewhere isolated with someone I'd just met didn't sit right with me. I tried to politely decline, but he kept insisting, saying he wanted to show me a special spot he knew. At that point, alarm bells were going off in my head, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I decided it was time to end the night. I thanked him for dinner but said I had to head home. He didn't seem too happy with my decision, but he kept smiling as he said goodbye. Something about the look in his eyes, though, left me feeling unsettled. I quickly said my goodbyes and got into my car, feeling a strange mix of relief and discomfort as I drove home. Later that night, when I was back home, that discomfort turned into fear. I was in bed, trying to unwind by reading a book, when I heard a faint tapping sound on my bedroom window. For a moment, I froze, hoping it was just my imagination. But the tapping continued, more insistent this time. My heart started racing, and with a knot in my stomach, I got out of bed and went to the window, praying it was just the wind or a tree branch. When I pulled back the curtain, my blood ran cold. There he was, David, standing outside, with a creepy smile on his face, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How did he find out where I lived? How did he get here so fast? Panic washed over me, and I backed away from the window, unsure of what to do. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. While waiting for them to arrive, I could hear David trying to open the window. He kept calling my name in this low, disturbing voice, like we were in some kind of twisted game. I hid in the bathroom, locking the door, praying the police would get there before he managed to break in. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. I could hear his footsteps around the house, the sound of something scraping against the wall, and my mind raced with fear. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights of the police car filled my window, and I heard voices shouting at him to stop. The silence that followed was as heavy as the fear that had been gripping me. When I finally stepped out of the bathroom, still shaking, the police were leading David away in handcuffs. He had that same unsettling smile on his face, as if he was satisfied with what he'd done. The police assured me that he would be taken into custody, but the trauma of that night wouldn't be easy to shake. What was supposed to be a normal date had turned into a nightmare I would never forget. In the days that followed, I made sure to increase security at my house. I changed the locks, installed security cameras, and had a friend stay with me for a few weeks. Still, the feeling of being watched never really left. The memory of David standing outside my window, trying to get in, haunted me every night. I've never been able to look at Tinder or any dating app the same way since. The whole experience made me more cautious, more suspicious. What I learned is that people aren't always what they seem, and danger can hide behind the friendliest of smiles. Now, every time I close the curtains at night, I still get a chill, hoping I won't find anyone on the other side, trying to come back into my life. I was never the type to believe that bad things happen to ordinary people. I always thought those bizarre stories we see in the news or in movies were distant, reserved for others. But that night, everything changed. I met Sarah on Tinder, and from the start, something about her drew me in. She was beautiful, friendly, and our conversations flowed naturally. It was like we had known each other for years. After exchanging messages for a few days, she suggested we meet in a quieter place, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The spot she picked was a small trail in a forested area outside of Portland, Oregon. The idea of an outdoor date seemed original and intriguing. She said she knew a place where we could see the stars, a spot not many people knew about. Despite a slight feeling of discomfort, I decided to trust her. After all, Sarah seemed genuine, and I had no reason to suspect anything. When I arrived at the meeting point, it was already getting dark. The trail was narrow, surrounded by tall trees that created an isolated, quiet atmosphere. I tried calling Sarah to let her know I was close, but the call went straight to voicemail. I figured she was already at the spot and decided to follow the trail. I walked for about 10 minutes, the crunch of dry leaves under my feet being the only sound in the air. That's when I saw a clearing ahead. There was an old, dirty car parked there, looking out of place. As I got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. When I was just a few feet from the car, two men stepped out of the shadows, armed and with threatening expressions. Before I could react, one of them pointed a gun at my chest while the other yelled at me to hand over everything I had. My mind went blank, and panic took over. Trembling, I pulled my wallet and phone from my pocket and handed them over without resistance. They searched through my belongings quickly, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. One of them smiled sinisterly when he found my credit cards and the cash I had. While one kept the gun pointed at me, the other went to my car and started rummaging through it. I was completely helpless. At that moment, I heard a familiar voice. Sarah appeared from behind the car, her face lit only by the dim light inside the vehicle. She didn't look surprised or scared. In fact, there was a look of satisfaction in her eyes. "Sorry, darling, but you were an easy target," she said, her voice cold and calculated. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The woman I thought I was about to have a romantic date with had lured me into a trap. The men laughed, like this was routine for them. Sarah walked closer and looked into my eyes, as if studying my reaction. I wanted to ask why, to understand what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. She turned to the men and gave them a nod, as if signaling them to finish what they'd started. One of the men shoved me to the ground and searched my pockets again while the other kept the gun pointed at me. Sarah just watched, showing no remorse or regret. I felt a wave of humiliation, anger mixed with fear. How could I have been so naive? How didn't I see that I was being manipulated the whole time? All I could think about was how to survive. After they took everything they wanted, the men got back in the car, and Sarah followed without looking back. Before getting in, she turned to me and said, "Don't try anything stupid, or next time, you won't make it out of here." And with that, they drove off, leaving me alone in the darkness, without money, without a phone, and with a fear I never imagined I'd feel. I lay there on the cold ground for what felt like an eternity. When I finally managed to stand up, my legs were shaking, and my whole body ached. I didn't know what to do or where to go. The forest around me felt closed in, almost suffocating. I started walking, trying to find my way back to the road, praying that the battery in my car hadn't been stolen along with everything else. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the lights of the main road. With what little strength I had left, I ran toward it and waved down the first car I saw. The driver, an elderly man, stopped and helped me call the police. When the officers arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but they looked at me with skepticism, as if it was hard to believe I had been tricked so easily. The investigation that followed revealed that Sarah, whose real name I never found out, was part of a gang that used dating apps to lure victims to isolated locations, where they were robbed or worse. I was just another victim in a long list. Even weeks later, it was hard to believe it had all happened to me. The feeling of vulnerability and betrayal still haunts me. Since that night, I've never been able to trust someone the same way again. The scars, both physical and emotional, are a constant reminder of the danger that lurks in the most unexpected places. And now, every time I think about how it all started, with a simple conversation on Tinder, I can't help but feel a chill. The real terror, I realized, doesn't come from monsters or ghosts, it comes from people hiding behind smiles and empty promises. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story. I never imagined that a simple Tinder date could turn into a nightmare so quickly. My name is Eric, and this story happened a few months ago when I was visiting some friends at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I decided to spend the weekend there, taking a break from my routine and exploring the city. After a quiet night, I figured I'd check out Tinder, not expecting much, just to see who was around. That's when I met Jessica. She seemed interesting, with a warm smile and easy conversation. After exchanging a few messages, we decided to meet up. She suggested I come over to her apartment since the city was busy because of a college football game, and the bars would be packed. The idea of a more relaxed date sounded perfect, and since she lived in a quiet residential neighborhood, I didn't see any reason to say no. That night, I got in my car and headed to the address Jessica had sent me. The neighborhood was full of old, charming houses, with big trees that made the streets darker and a little more mysterious at night. When I arrived, I parked in front of a well-kept house with a wide porch and dim lights illuminating the entrance. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but there was something about the atmosphere that made me feel slightly uneasy. As I walked up to the door, I noticed a shadow moving quickly past a second-story window. It felt like someone was watching me from inside the house, but when I looked closer, there was no one there. I rang the doorbell, and I could hear hurried footsteps behind the door before it opened. Jessica appeared, smiling, but there was something off in her eyes, like she was nervous or hiding something. She invited me in, and the inside of the house was cozy, filled with old furniture and a fireplace that seemed like it had just been put out. As we sat in the living room, I couldn't help but notice the slightly open doors down the hallway, as if someone had been peeking through them. Jessica tried to keep the conversation casual, but I felt restless, like I was being watched, and that feeling wouldn't go away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a whisper coming from behind one of the doors. My body froze. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jessica laughed nervously and said it was probably just the wind, but the sound was too clear to be something so simple. My gut was telling me something was wrong, and with every passing second, that sense of danger grew stronger. I decided it was time to leave. I stood up and told her I had to go, making up an excuse about an early morning commitment. Jessica tried to persuade me to stay a little longer, but I was determined. As I walked toward the door, I noticed the shadows behind the hallway doors shifting again, like multiple people were watching me. My heart raced. Once I stepped outside, I felt a brief sense of relief, but it quickly vanished when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't wait to see who or what was following me. I ran to my car, unlocked the doors, and jumped in, starting the engine as fast as I could. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw several figures standing outside the house, watching me leave. I drove for a few minutes before stopping at a gas station, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jessica. "You left too fast. I guess you realized you weren't alone. Maybe next time, you won't be so lucky." That message confirmed everything I had feared. The date was a setup, and I had barely escaped. I blocked Jessica's number immediately and contacted the police to report what happened, but there wasn't much they could do with so little information. Since that night, I haven't used dating apps again. The thought of trusting someone I met online fills me with dread. That experience taught me that sometimes, real terror hides behind people who seem the most normal, and danger can be lurking in the most unexpected places. Now, every time I think about meeting someone new, I remember Jessica's strange look and those shadows behind the doors, and I know I'll never be the same. I've always been cautious about online dating, but after seeing so many of my friends meet great people on Tinder, I decided to give it a shot. I was living in Denver at the time, where life can get pretty hectic, so meeting someone online seemed more convenient. That's how I met Alex. He seemed normal, funny, thoughtful, and we had a lot in common. After chatting for a while, we decided to meet up at a coffee shop downtown. The first impression was great. He was polite, had good conversation skills, and made me feel comfortable. After that first date, things progressed naturally. We went out a few more times, and Alex always seemed like the perfect guy. He was sweet, sent me kind messages throughout the day, and genuinely seemed interested in me. At first, I thought I had finally found someone special. But slowly, little red flags started to appear. He always seemed to know where I was, even when I hadn't told him. He'd comment on my clothes or what I'd been doing in a way that made it clear he was paying very close attention. By the third week, I started to feel like something was off. He began messaging me constantly, asking who I was with, what I was doing, and would get irritated if I didn't respond right away. One day, he showed up at my work unannounced, saying he wanted to have lunch with me. I was busy, but he insisted until I agreed. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to make things awkward. Every day that passed, Alex seemed more obsessed, and I began to feel suffocated. I knew it was time to end things. We agreed to meet at a park, and I tried to be as direct and honest as possible. I explained that I needed space, that I wasn't ready for something so intense. He was silent for a moment, then his behavior changed dramatically. He started begging me to reconsider, saying he couldn't live without me. When I stood my ground, he began to cry and shout, drawing attention from people nearby. That scene was unsettling, but what came next was even worse. The next day, he showed up at my apartment door with flowers, acting like nothing had happened. I tried to be kind but firm, asking him to leave. He didn't like that, but eventually, he left. However, that was just the beginning. Alex started showing up everywhere I went. If I went out to dinner with friends, he'd accidentally show up. When I went to the gym, there he was. Things escalated quickly, and I had no peace. He left gifts and notes at my door, some of them saying disturbing things like, "You can't escape us," or "We're meant to be together." Every time I saw him, his behavior became more aggressive, and there was a look in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before, something between anger and obsession. I knew I needed help, but part of me still didn't want to believe this was really happening. I talked to a few friends, and they urged me to go to the authorities. I went to the police and explained the situation. They advised me to get a restraining order, which I did that same day. The idea that I needed legal protection from someone who, just weeks ago, seemed so normal was surreal. Even after the restraining order, Alex kept trying to contact me. He sent messages from different numbers, made new social media profiles, and one night, I even heard footsteps outside my apartment. But when I looked out the window, no one was there. I was living in constant fear, always expecting him to show up anywhere, at any time. A month later, just when I thought things were starting to calm down, I got a message that made my blood run cold. It simply said, "I'll always be around." That's when I realized that, even with the restraining order, I would never truly feel safe. The police increased patrols in my area, and I became much more cautious about my safety, but the fear never left. Finally, I made the decision to move to another city. I requested a transfer at work and relocated to Seattle, hoping for a fresh start. The move was tough but necessary. I left behind everything that reminded me of Alex, hoping he would never find out where I went. Still, every notification on my phone, every stranger who got too close, sent a chill down my spine. Now, months later, I'm starting to find peace again. But the trauma is still there. Anytime someone mentions online dating, I get a shiver down my spine. My experience with Alex taught me that danger can hide in the most ordinary people, and real terror is much more horrifying when it invades your life so unexpectedly and insidiously. I'm still learning to trust again, but always with a bit of caution, knowing that sometimes, the monster isn't who you expect. It all started so innocently, like most real-life horror stories do. I was in my second year at the University of Washington in Seattle, and between classes, work, and parties, I decided to give Tinder a try. It was just a distraction, a way to meet new people without any expectations. That's how I met Jake. He was charming, attentive, and seemed different from the other guys. We talked for days before finally deciding to meet. Our first date was at a cafe near campus. He looked exactly like his photos, tall, dark hair, piercing eyes. The conversation was light and relaxed, and soon we were laughing about random things. He seemed genuinely interested in me, which was flattering, though a little intense. When the date ended, he walked me back to my dorm and said goodbye with a smile. There was nothing wrong with that night, or at least that's what I thought. The next day, I started noticing something strange. Jake kept messaging me constantly, and it wasn't just a good morning or how are you. It was questions about what I was doing every minute, where I was, who I was with. I tried to brush off the red flags, telling myself he was just being attentive, but soon things spiraled out of control. He showed up unannounced at the cafe where I was studying, even though I hadn't told him I'd be there. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then he started showing up at other places I frequented, like the library and even my classes, despite not being a student in that course. I began to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding paranoid. Maybe I was overreacting, I thought, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Jake was everywhere I went, and more, it felt like he was following me. Things escalated one night when something truly disturbing happened. I was in my dorm room, studying for a test, when I felt a chill. I glanced at the window, and there he was, standing in the dark, just watching me. My heart stopped. I was on the second floor, and he was out there, looking directly at me. I didn't know what to do. Every part of me screamed to call the police, but I was in shock, frozen by the situation. After that night, it only got worse. He kept sending messages, telling me he was thinking about me, that he wanted to see me. I blocked his number, but he found ways to reach out, creating new profiles or using different numbers. I started getting paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified that he could appear at any moment. Sleeping became impossible. I'd lie awake, waiting to hear footsteps outside my window. I told some friends about what was happening, and they urged me to report him, but something inside me hesitated. What if I was overreacting? But the truth was, I was scared, and my life was turning into a nightmare. Each day, I felt more isolated, trapped in this cycle of fear and anxiety that seemed never-ending. Jake's obsession was consuming me, and I knew I had to do something before it was too late. Finally, I decided to confront him. I arranged to meet him in a public place, somewhere I felt safer, and I got straight to the point. I told him I didn't want to see him anymore, that he was scaring me, and that it had to stop. His reaction is something I'll never forget. He just sat there, staring at me with those blank eyes. It was like talking to a wall, no emotion on his face. For a moment, I thought he might do something, but then he just stood up and walked away. The days that followed were nerve-wracking. I didn't know if he had actually understood, if he would respect my request, or if things would only get worse. I began seeing less of him around, but the feeling that I was being watched never left. It was as if, at any moment, he could reappear. My studies suffered, and I started distancing myself from friends, all because of the constant fear that consumed me. One night, while walking back to my dorm, I heard footsteps behind me. Panic set in, but when I turned around, no one was there. My heart raced as I sprinted to my room, locking the door behind me. I stayed up all night, haunted by the sound of Jake's heavy breathing in my mind, even though I knew he wasn't there. The trauma of what I'd been through stayed with me for months, and I knew it would take time to recover. Slowly, Jake's presence in my life started to fade. The messages stopped, and I stopped seeing him around campus. I don't know what made him stop, whether it was the confrontation or if he just lost interest, but the relief was overwhelming. Still, I knew I'd never be the same. The fear of being watched, of being vulnerable, lingered, and my trust in people was forever shaken. Even now, when I pass by that cafe or hear a noise at night, the fear creeps back in. I remember the reflection in the window, the feeling of being watched, and the panic that followed. That experience taught me just how dangerous obsession can be, and how real terror doesn't need ghosts or monsters, it just takes someone who refuses to accept no. With every step I take, I still feel like Jake could be lurking nearby, waiting. And that, maybe, is the scariest part of all. I had always been careful when it came to online dating. Growing up in Boise, Idaho, where most people knew each other, the idea of meeting strangers online had always felt a bit risky to me. But after moving to Portland, I decided to give Tinder a try. Between work and the busy city life, it was hard to meet people the traditional way to meet in person. Ryan suggested a cozy bar in downtown Portland, a place I was familiar with and where I felt safe. He seemed friendly, with easy conversation and nothing unusual about him. He was the kind of person who made me feel comfortable right away, so I started to relax, thinking maybe this would be a good experience after all. For the first half hour, everything went well. We talked about our jobs, hobbies, and shared stories about our hometowns. Ryan was well-spoken and seemed genuinely interested in me. But as the night went on, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. He began asking questions that felt a little too personal for a first date, like where exactly I lived and who I lived with. I tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, but he always found a way to circle back to those details. I kept ignoring the subtle red flags, convincing myself that it was just nerves. But then something unsettling happened. I went to the bathroom, and as I was washing my hands, I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by the door in the mirror. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I turned to leave, I saw Ryan standing there, holding his phone as if he was about to take a picture. My heart started racing. "Ryan, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He quickly put his phone away and laughed, saying he was just texting and didn't mean to scare me. But something about the way he hurried to hide his phone and avoided eye contact gave me chills. At that moment, I knew something was wrong. I went back to the table, but I was on high alert. I made up an excuse about needing to leave early because I had to get up early the next day. Ryan seemed disappointed, but didn't push. He offered to walk me to my car, but I politely declined, saying I was fine on my own. His smile seemed forced, and deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As soon as I got into my car, I blocked Ryan on all social media and Tinder. What was supposed to be a pleasant night had turned into something unsettling. I couldn't stop thinking about what he might have been planning. Worst-case scenarios raced through my mind. What if he had taken the picture? What if he had followed me home? Panic began to settle in, so I drove straight to a friend's house to spend the night. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started noticing little things that made me feel uncomfortable, like an unfamiliar car parked near my apartment or a notification that someone had tried to access one of my online accounts. Paranoia crept in, and every sound in the night made me jump. It felt like my sense of privacy had vanished. I told a few of my friends about what had happened, and they were just as freaked out as I was. They all agreed that I did the right thing by blocking Ryan immediately, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I began avoiding going out alone and changed my routines, hoping that if he was following me, he'd get thrown off. But the truth was, I didn't know if I was actually in danger or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Finally, after a few weeks, things seemed to settle down. The strange card disappeared, and the attempts to access my account stopped. Slowly, I convinced myself that Ryan had either lost interest or that maybe he hadn't been following me at all. But the fear still lingered, a reminder that my sense of safety had been shattered so quickly. Even now, every time I walk by that bar, I get a chill. I remember the reflection in the mirror, the feeling of being watched, and the panic that followed. That experience taught me to be even more cautious and to trust my instincts, even when everything seems normal. Real terror doesn't always come with loud, obvious signs. Sometimes it hides in the smallest details, the things we overlook, making us question what's real. Since that night, I've never used a dating app again. The idea of meeting another stranger online fills me with anxiety, and I can't help but think about what could have happened if I hadn't acted when I did. The scariest part is knowing that danger was so close, hidden behind a friendly smile and casual conversation. Now, whenever I enter a new place, I look around more carefully, knowing that real fear can be lurking just around the corner, disguised as normal. I've always been an optimist when it came to meeting new people. Friends told me that trying out dating apps was a good idea, especially with my hectic life in Chicago. After a lot of hesitation, I finally gave in and created a profile on Tinder. At first, everything seemed normal, casual conversations, quick dates, and the occasional laugh. That's how I met Adam. He seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. Adam was charming, funny, and said all the right things. After a few weeks of messaging, he invited me to dinner at a fancy restaurant on Michigan Avenue. I was excited, thinking maybe this was the start of something special. When the day of the date came, I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made me feel confident. I was nervous, but in a good way, full of hope. The restaurant was beautiful, with an amazing view of the Chicago skyline. Adam was already there when I arrived, and his impeccable appearance and warm smile instantly put me at ease. The conversation flowed easily, and he seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. But as dinner went on, I started to notice a few things that made me uncomfortable. He asked a lot of questions about my personal life, my job, my possessions, in a way that felt more like an interrogation than casual curiosity. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But as the night progressed, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. Adam mentioned that he had business overseas and traveled often, but he was vague about what exactly he did. There was something about his demeanor that felt rehearsed, like he was playing a role he had carefully practiced. As the evening continued, my gut told me that something was very wrong. When the bill arrived, he insisted on paying, but as we waited, I noticed he seemed nervous. His hands trembled slightly, and he avoided making direct eye contact, focusing on the table or looking around the restaurant. I started to feel more and more unsettled, and the thought that something sinister was going on crept into my mind. After dinner, he suggested we head to a nearby bar to continue the night. I didn't want to be rude, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of the situation. I politely declined, making up an excuse about having an early commitment the next day. Adam pushed a little, but when he saw I wasn't budging, his expression changed. The smile vanished, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. He didn't bother hiding his displeasure anymore, and as he walked me to my car, the silence between us was deafening. I thought about calling a friend to meet me, but I was afraid it might make things worse. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't out of danger yet. In the days that followed, I started to notice signs that I was being followed. A car that always seemed to be on the same street as me, text messages from unknown numbers asking about me, and even an attempt to access my bank account. Each new detail confirmed what I feared. Adam wasn't just any guy. He was after something, and I had become his target. I changed all my passwords, blocked his number, and became extremely cautious about my daily routines. But the fear stayed with me. Every time I left my house, I felt like I was being watched, and every time I got a message, I dreaded that it might be another attempt from him to reach me. The idea that he could be monitoring me from the shadows turned every moment of my life into a quiet nightmare. One night, while I was at home, I got a notification from an unknown number. The message was short, but its impact was devastating. "You shouldn't have run away so fast. We'll meet again soon." My heart nearly stopped. That was my breaking point. I knew I had to do something before things got worse. I called the police and reported everything, from the dinner to the threatening messages. While they assured me they would do what they could to investigate, I knew this was far from over. I moved to a new apartment, one that was safer and farther away from my old neighborhood. I installed security cameras and made sure to be extra careful about what I shared online. The experience left me deeply scarred, and even now, I struggle to fully trust people I meet on the internet. The trauma is a constant reminder that sometimes, danger hides where you least expect it. Now, every time someone mentions online dating, I get a chill down my spine. The story of Adam taught me that trust is something valuable and shouldn't be given away so easily. Real terror, I've learned, doesn't come from movies or books, it comes from the people we meet in everyday life, the ones who can turn a simple night out into a nightmare. I always thought I was good at judging people's character. Growing up in a quiet neighborhood in Boston, where everyone knew each other, gave me a sense of confidence in my ability to tell who was trustworthy and who wasn't. But recently, that confidence was shaken in a way I never expected. I met a woman named Laura on Tinder. She seemed amazing, smart, funny, and, most importantly, genuine. After a few weeks of messaging back and forth, we decided to meet in person. Our first date went great. We picked a bar in downtown Boston, a cozy spot with good music and a relaxed vibe. The conversation flowed easily, and Laura seemed like exactly the kind of person I was looking for. After a few hours of laughing and sharing stories, she invited me over to her apartment to keep talking. The idea of extending the night sounded good, so I agreed. Her apartment was in an old, well-kept building in a quiet residential neighborhood. We walked up the stairs, still laughing, excited about how the night was going. When we got inside, the place felt cozy, nicely decorated, and full of personal touches that reflected her personality. She offered me a drink, and we continued our conversation on the couch. Everything seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. And that's when things started to change. Not long after we settled on the couch, I heard a noise at the door. I figured it was something normal, maybe the wind or a neighbor, but Laura tensed up visibly. Before I could ask what was going on, the door swung open, and a man walked into the apartment. He was big, with a furious expression, and barely looked at me before shouting, "Who the hell are you?" I froze, not knowing how to react. Laura jumped up and tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. "He's just a friend," she said, but he completely ignored her and came straight toward me. That's when I realized how serious this was. This man wasn't a stranger, he was her boyfriend, something she never mentioned. The look in his eyes was pure rage, and I knew I was in danger. I tried to stand up and explain that I didn't know anything, that this was all a misunderstanding, but he wasn't interested in hearing it. He shoved me back onto the couch with enough force to knock the wind out of me. Panic started to set in, and my options were shrinking fast. Laura was in a frenzy, trying to calm him down, but he seemed blinded by anger. I needed to get out of there, and quickly. In a moment of distraction, when he turned to yell at Laura, I seized my chance and jumped up. I ran for the door, hearing his heavy footsteps right behind me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I managed to yank the door open and sprinted down the hallway of the building, not daring to look back. All I wanted was to reach the street and get as far away from that insane situation as possible. When I finally made it outside, the adrenaline was still pumping through my veins. I glanced over my shoulder to see if he was following me, but there was no sign of anyone. I kept running, turning a corner and ducking into an alley just to make sure I wasn't being chased. By that point, my mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. How had I been so blind? How did I not see that something was off? When I finally stopped, hiding in the shadows of a building, I pulled out my phone and called a cab. I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. The feeling of being hunted was still fresh, and I couldn't calm down. On the ride home, the images of the night kept replaying in my head. Every detail, every expression on Laura's and her boyfriend's faces, every word spoken and unspoken. Once I got home, I locked the door with every lock I had and sat down on the floor, trying to get a grip. The reality of what could have happened if he had caught up to me hit hard. It was terrifying to think how close I came to something truly awful. For a moment, I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There was no evidence, just the word of a terrified guy who barely escaped. In the days that followed, I deleted Tinder and avoided going out. Paranoia crept in, and I found myself looking out the window, afraid that Laura's boyfriend might show up to finish what he started. Eventually, the fear began to fade, but the distrust and trauma lingered. I knew I'd never be the same. The confidence I had in my ability to judge people was shattered, and the idea of meeting someone new filled me with dread. Now, whenever I think about Laura and that night, I get chills. I can't help but wonder if she planned it all, or if it was just a terrible mistake in judgment. Either way, what was supposed to be a pleasant evening turned into the worst nightmare of my life. That experience taught me that real terror doesn't come from monsters or ghosts, it comes from people who hide their true intentions, waiting for the right moment to strike. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss the next video. Check out 10 terrifying true scary stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.